Do you remember that fear that you had in the spring of 2020? A new disease was spreading. There was conflicting information. Was this going to blow over? Was it the end of the world as we know it? It turns out it wasn't, at least not in the truest sense. But that fear that the society around us that we take for granted every day could crumble is an uncomfortable one. Today, we're interviewing a man who spends his time exploring the historical causes of that fear, the reasons for societal collapse, and what it's like to live through it when it truly is the end. His name is Paul M. Cooper, and he's the host of my favorite history podcast, The Fall of Civilisations. This is a very special episode of Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. Every episode, we bring you conversations about history that fell through the cracks of your curriculum. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins. Today, we have a particularly special guest for you. He is the host and creator of the Fall of Civilisations podcast, Paul Cooper, who has a new book out in the UK titled Fall of Civilisations, Stories of Greatness and Decline, and the American edition will be out in July. Thank you for joining us, Paul.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'll just start out in saying I'm a big fan of your podcast. I've been listening, I think, for about 4.5 years. So not quite since from the beginning, but pretty close to the beginning. And it is fairly unique and an interesting perspective on history as far as podcast goes. And we were lucky enough to get a copy of your new book. And I hope you don't mind me spoiling the first half of the first page of your introduction to any potential readers.
Yeah, well, as long as you don't give away how any of the societies end.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, I won't spoil it. Those things. But you start the book off with this quote from a man named Walter Benjamin in a book, Theses on Philosophy of History. It is a pretty melancholy description of what it's like to witness history and look backwards at everything. And it's described as an angel being hurtled essentially backwards, watching the destruction of time that time rots in front of it, getting piled and piled upon itself without being able to do anything about it. And I took a look at that paragraph, and then I was actually playing with my son around that time, and we have a magnolia tree in one of our in our yard, and he's 1 year old, so he's a little guy just exploring the world, and the petals have started falling off of the flowers, and he grabbed one of the petals and he kept saying "on," like he wanted me to put it back on the tree because he saw it fall, and I was trying to explain to him that I can't. So then eventually I held him up and he tried to press it back onto the tree, and then realized he couldn't and burst into tears. And I was like, I think it was a pretty apt, because I was thinking about these themes and the themes that are in your podcast and in your book, and it is a sad thing. It is there's something remarkably sad about this, and I wanted to start off with asking you, what was the inception of this podcast? Given that there's lots you could choose to study about history, you're obviously interested in the subject very deeply. Why something that is where you're watching destruction and going over these really, really depressing subjects over and over again?
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful story about your son. That's it almost feels like it should be in a haiku. It's amazing. I was reading the other day that magnolia trees are one of the most ancient flowering trees in the world as well. They evolved before there were even bees, and so were primarily pollinated by beetles, which is why the flowers are so enormous.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, funny little thing.
Yeah.
Well, I started the podcast, which really flowed naturally out of my PhD research, which looked at the figure of the ruin and how artists, writers, filmmakers, novelists have used the ruin in their work to talk about loss and talk about, what your son was experiencing for the first time, a loss that can't be repaired, that can't be undone, the linear passage of time and the passing of everything into entropy, I began to share on Twitter stories about ruined places in the world and why they were interesting, because they're some of the most fascinating places in the world. Every ruin is a place where, time kind of stands still, but is also extremely evident. Time has worked on this ruined castle or abbey in an immensely destructive way, but the building still stands there in defiance of time. There are also places where our imaginations are firing off constantly. When I was a kid and I visited many of the ruined castles that they have in Wales, where I grew up, it's one of the biggest densities of ruined castles in Europe. I would always, imagine the people walking on the floors that had disappeared and, walking through the doorways. And they became spaces where I felt like I was always imagining. They were really lively spaces. And I found that on Twitter, people shared that feeling that there was something inspiring, something strange, something uncanny about these ruined places. So the podcast was really then an attempt to take that further and try to use each ruin as almost like the dead body on the first page of a detective novel. We open with this ruined place that someone is always experiencing for the first time. I try to go back as far as I can to maybe find the first person who wrote down an account of a particular ruin, and that particular feeling of awe and melancholy that affected them when they saw it. And then to rewind the clock and ask, how did that ruin get there? I say in the book that every ruin is a place where one day the future was cancelled. And for that reason, there's always an interesting story to be told about them. There's always a break or a rupture or something dramatic happened here, because this was a palace and now there's sand wandering through the halls. I feel like that's something that's really resonated with people.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I always like to ask early on the most seemingly simple question, which is, how do you define civilization in your podcast and in your book? So how are you choosing what is and doesn't apply?
Civilization is such a loaded term that I think if you're writing an academic paper, you wouldn't use it. But I think when you're writing popular history, you sometimes have to meet people where they are and, use terms people are going to react to. For me, a civilization is just any human society. I don't laden it with any value or, try to set a threshold for it. So, for instance, in the podcast, we've looked at some very small societies like the Norse Greenlanders, who, probably only were a few thousand people at any one time. I think it's important not to place any particular burden on the term civilization.
It's interesting that one of the stylistic choices that you made was to try to describe what it was like for people at the time. What was that reasoning behind that choice? Because you could have taken a pretty broad sort of academic sweeping approach to these, but your podcasts do, and the book and the descriptions in the book feel very personal. Yeah,
that's always what's fascinated me about the past. The sense that the people who lived through these periods were real and they really went through this stuff, but that we, to some extent, can never really access how it felt for them or what their worldview looked like. I was a historical novelist. I've written 2 historical novels that both, tried to bring back a ruined place to life and imagine what the lives of people who lived there were like. And so that's always fascinated me. And I think, people come to something like a history podcast because they want to learn the facts. They might want to learn that, wonderful fact that makes you the most interesting person at a dinner party. Maybe you've got a long commute and you just want to feel like you're improving yourself while you're on the bus, on the train. But there's also this emotional element that's like, there's a tradition that goes back to the just dawn of time when people have just wanted to gather around a campfire and hear what things were like in the time of the ancestors. They just want to hear stories about the past and the people who came before us. And it's what, drove things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's one of the oldest storytelling impulses. So for me, it's always just think, wait a minute, what did it actually sound like and smell like and feel like on the streets of Nineveh or Angkor during the Cambodian Golden Age, in Tenochtitlan in the time of the Aztecs? Those are the parts that always make me feel like the story's coming alive.
Absolutely. Well, I know Isaac said he's been listening for many years, and I'll admit that before I started this podcast, I really wasn't even a podcast listener, because I'm a very visual person, and so it's tough for me sometimes to listen to podcasts. So I was rather shocked when I was able to listen to 3 hours of yours and not have my mind wander. And I think part of it is that it's stories, but I also loved that you had music. Culture. There was music from the era, what the language sounded like, things that we have every day in our everyday lives, but we don't think about maybe. Yeah. And then you also would send people to your Patreon account, and you could see these things. You could see paintings. You could see, images. And to me, that just makes it so much more interactive. Was this something that you started with, that you said you wanted to give people more sources, or is it something that sort of grew over time?
Yeah, I've always wanted the show to be led by the primary sources. And so instead of, always me narrating, I try to quote at length from these, pieces of writing from the time, eyewitnesses, people who are writing poetry and songs and so on. And I've always tried to give people, as you mentioned, just that little bit extra in the episode. I've always tried to think like, what's going to make this one special? If we're talking about the Aztecs, can I find someone who speaks Nahuatl and who can read things like the Florentine Codex, these indigenous accounts of these events unfolding? Can they read it in Nahuatl, in the surviving language? It just allows people to hear, not just the words, but like the texture of the language, to get a sense of the oral culture and what these people sounded like as well. Similar thing with the Byzantine Empire, who I managed to find a Greek Orthodox choir in London who just sung these absolutely transcendental Byzantine chants that just have this absolute resonance and majesty to them that, I was trying to edit this thing and getting goosebumps from them. They're beautiful pieces of music. But for the visual people out there as well, there's also our YouTube channel that since the COVID pandemic and all those times we just all couldn't go outside, I put those hours into setting the podcast to video. So we now have footage of the archaeological sites with maps, shots of the primary sources, that kind of thing, which has been really rewarding to try and bring the stories to life. I always want it to be an audio show first and primarily, but video editing is really fun as well. And as the show's gone on a little more and our resources have built, I've been able to contract local filmmakers, for instance. We have a wonderful drone operator who works out of Baghdad. So whenever we go to Mesopotamia, I call up Mohammed and ask if we can go out to these archaeological sites, and he gets these wonderful tracking shots over these lands striated with broken walls, and Babylon and Nineveh and Ashur and so on. That's
amazing. It definitely brings another element to it. Since you brought up Iraq, I'm curious. There was a little excerpt in your introduction that I was genuinely curious about. How did you find yourself in Saddam's palace?
Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah, the book opens with a little meditation on myself and time I spent in Iraq, visiting the ruins of Saddam Hussein's palace, which overlooks the ruins of Babylon, which Saddam Hussein was obsessed with. A big part of his mythos, his totalitarian identity, was that he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, of these kings of Sumer and Akkad and ancient Mesopotamia, before he had his more kind of Islamic phase later in his life. But this palace is now amazing because it's a ruin itself. It's completely desolate. The chandeliers collapsed, and there are just children playing in it. But it overlooks this much more ancient ruin, and you get this kind of ironic juxtaposition of the modern and ancient ruin that I always found really fascinating. So my part of my PhD looked at Iraqi writers, the novelist Sinan Antoon and the filmmaker Mohammed al-Daraji, who both in really interesting ways use ruins, use the ancient past of Iraq to comment on its modern history and modern trauma, modern pain. So in 2016, I was at the Babylon Festival of Arts and Culture, which is a remarkable little arts and literary festival that takes place in the ruins of Babylon. Really, really amazing. And I returned later that year as well to do a bigger kind of tour of the country. There were only two companies at the time who were able to run tours who'd been authorized.
Sure. Yeah.
And there was like war going on in the north at the time, so it was limited what you could go to. But it was absolutely amazing. It's a beautiful country.
It's a really striking juxtaposition.
And similar to that, you had mentioned how Saddam Hussein had put his name in the bricks. So it was almost like a ruins on top of ruins, and he had sort of like inserted himself into that history, which was really interesting to me, because we think of these ruins sort of as just from their time period. It's like their primary source, but sometimes they're layered because later generations sort of stamp their aspect, there's something about them onto the ruins as well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing you talk about in the one particular episode on the Incans, I believe. The idea of a civilization that is ancient to us or non-existent to us, building on top of an ancient, far more ancient civilization that was there prior to them.
Yeah, it's moments like that you get a real sense for the deep time, and just human history as this slate that's being erased and written over and over again. There's never just a city never just, or rarely just, collapses and is abandoned and then covered by the sands. There's almost always an afterlife to the site. And Babylon is one of the most interesting of those sites, because you just get this constant reimagining of it. It's, in the Bible. So throughout the Middle Ages, people are talking about Babylon as a avatar of a kind of oppressive totalitarian society, an evil society. You get, the colonial sort of despoilation of Iraq when people come and start stripping Babylon of its tiles. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon is now in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and there's now a kind of simulacrum in its place in Babylon. And then Saddam Hussein himself trying to stamp, as you said, his own name into the bricks. You get this sense of an archaeological site that's constantly being reimagined and rethought. And now with modern filmmakers like Mohammed al-Daraji's film Son of Babylon, where a child who's traveling south to Baghdad to try and find his father, who was imprisoned by the regime, as the regime is collapsing in 2003. This boy is wandering through the ruins of Babylon and just seeing these fallen walls, and they're incomprehensible to him. Because as a child he doesn't have this sense of history, but they just come to represent. His father's called Ibrahim, and there's a site there called Beit Ibrahim, the House of Ibrahim, and he thinks his father might be there. A remarkable movie.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I'll have to check it out. To take a step back to your process in making these episodes, Lynn is an archivist, so she works in the archives here in the US, with documents that are far less old than some of the ones that you're referencing.
They're brand new.
They're brand new compared, very fresh out the
package
for American history. It's all relatively new.
You're doing God's work there. I've done some work in archives myself in the university in East Anglia. What do you archive?
Well, actually, I'm a documentary editor, so I worked on the George Washington papers, and now I'm working on the Abraham Lincoln papers. So, reliving the Lincoln-Douglas debates at the moment.
Wow, that must be amazing.
It really
reads
is.
A lot of dead people's mail.
I do.
But so thinking about those sources, what is your process for going through and finding these things? Especially I can't imagine that you're familiar already with many of sort of the languages that you're working in and those things. How do you go about, like, if you have an idea for a new episode, working your way through that?
Yeah, it's quite a slow process. I think as I've gone on, I've got two researchers who, once I've decided what the episode is going to be, I'm usually still in the middle of audio editing, video editing for the last one. So I send them off to find just as much as they can, anything they think is interesting, pertinent, and especially primary sources, to really try and drill down to where is this history coming from. what is the base strata of what people are writing about this period. And then it's just, once I actually get down to doing the research myself, it's just reading everything I can find. We have a wonderful library here here in Norwich in the UK called the Robert Sainsbury Memorial Library, which has a remarkable collection of books that are often pretty hard to find elsewhere. I have a Reader's Card in the university library, and I'm using that to kind of loan books from the British Library where needed. And I also have a JSTOR subscription, and I just kind of strip mine that for everything I can read. Just trying to immerse myself in it. I watch as many documentaries as I can about the subject, because often they're already writing for a wider audience. They're already kind of picking out the themes and major conflicts, but I also want to set myself apart from them. I don't just want to go through the kind of well-trodden track that every documentary follows. I want to say, well, how can I depart? How can I do something different?
And I mean, your episodes may be, 2, 3, 4 hours, several parts. Yeah. But still, when you're looking at how much you're talking about, you are definitely paring down a lot of information.
Yeah.
So how do you decide what not to include? And, some things are, educated guesses by experts in, in the subject. So you can't just state facts. That's not going to be, the story. There's always debates. So how in the world do you manage to pare down everything you have into a pretty succinct episode, really?
Yeah. It's, as you said, like deciding what not to include is a huge part of the whole process, as it is with any story, any novel or film. Where does the story start? Where does it end? That was a big challenge, for instance, with the Egypt episode I just released, where my wife is always telling me to make the episodes shorter because, they take so long to do, honestly. And yeah, she can get a bit sick of me disappearing into these projects. So every time she's checking with me, how long is this one? I'm saying, well, it's about 30,000 words. And yeah, she kind of rolls her eyes. But yeah, as you said, I think just it's finding, first of all, structure. So this is going to need, like any story, a beginning, middle, and end. And we're going to need to tell a story which has story beats. And just like in a novel or film, a beat is where something changes. In every scene, something is going to move from 0 to 1, or it's going to move from angry to sad. So I try not to just include everything where you could just get bogged down forever in every battle, every king, and also every historical debate, because, as they say, if you have 10 historians in a room, you're going to hear 11 opinions. You could just the whole thing could collapse into grey goo under the cloud of uncertainty that surrounds every single fact or so-called fact in history. So you more or less have to, I work by consensus, essentially. I would rarely divert from what most historians believe to be the current consensus. Although I do like to depart imaginatively sometimes. And once I've applied that kind of idea about what I'm actually going to be saying happened, it's about drilling down to the archetypes of the story. So it's just boring to say that a king, rose to power, enacted these reforms. We have to say, well, who was this king? And that again goes back to things like the Iliad and Odyssey, where it's not just Achilles, it's strong-armed Achilles, We have to tell this story so that this is Hamlet, This is a young prince whose father was killed, and this is the major struggle of his life. This is how he must have felt, or at least we can imagine he felt. And so then it's just telling a story consistent with the historical facts that is also, that feels alive in that way, that feels alive in the sense of the structure of stories and the structure of archetypes.
Very difficult to do, by the way.
Just thread that needle.
It's just so hard. And I think your sensibilities as a novelist definitely come through there as a storyteller.
Thank you.
Versus, not to say that many historians are dry, but I've read a lot of books that are that my wife couldn't get through the first like 2 or 3 pages where she was like, there's no way. But
it can be
it's
a
very
bit of a
effective.
crisis in historical writing, but there are some great writers.
There are some wonderful ones, but I think your work is particularly evocative and emotional and interesting, and it's interesting to hear you come at it at such an early stage. Thinking about it. It's not just the sound design. It's not just it's literally how you're arcing the overall tale that you're telling with this civilization's rise and fall.
Using Egypt as an example, we could have stopped the story at the end of the Old Kingdom and just told like quite a sustained story. But I just begin to think, am I going to come back to this? Am I going to, or can we do the whole thing?
Right.
Obviously, this means when you've got not just 33 kings, but 33 dynasties of kings, you're looking at, more than 100 pharaohs. You're just having to fast forward so much that it requires a lot of skipping. But the key is just, we don't zoom in on anything where something didn't fundamentally change, where the story wasn't taken forward. So there were some wonderfully interesting Egyptian rulers, but their reigns more or less left Egypt in a state that was similar to how they found it. I try to avoid those parts of the story. This is my cat Hugo, by the way. He's always trying to be famous. Yeah.
Hugo, everybody.
Was Egypt the longest time period that you covered? I imagine it was probably.
In terms of the time period, it was the longest. Although the Aztecs episode was about 10-15 minutes longer.
Okay,
in terms of the episode.
Although, to be honest, that got me on that particular episode got me down a rabbit hole. I hadn't, I wasn't even aware. They're going to speak to the value of the sourcing that you used. I wasn't aware of the contemporaneous, how robust the contemporaneous accounts of all of that were. This part of this show's Inception was about history that when you're in the classroom and ask a question and then your professor is like, we can't really get into that right now. And it just feels like there's so much left on the bookshelf when that happens. But that one in particular, it really exploded like an area of interest of mine, and how alive the documentation is and how the documentation felt. Really interesting. But speaking of those things, when you're dealing with, when speaking of bringing things to life, when you're dealing with actors and hiring these voice actors to do and singers, is that a separate step of the process? Like, where does that come in terms of your production? Are you imagining those things from the get? Where you're like, I want to be able to see if I can get someone to do this voice, or this music would be cool.
I wish I planned ahead a little more, but I as much as I can, I try to look ahead and think, is there something that's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to finish? Because if you're asking a musician to record, 8 tracks originally, compose and record, gather musicians together, then you're going to have to be thinking about that a little far in advance. So I try to do that as much as possible, because you don't want the whole production to be like waiting for one thing,
Do you get to travel a lot?
Yeah, I wish I had used the show as an excuse to travel a little more. Although I have been to many of the sites discussed. Yeah, I've been to Peru and Jordan and Iraq, and I try to travel as widely as possible.
Oh, that's great. There's so I guess we could shift the topic of conversation over to the book, which we are here to chat about. As much as I enjoy the podcast, do you find this switching of mediums was it easy? Did it feel like you were going back to something you were more familiar with, since obviously been doing the podcast for a while, but you started off as a writer. What was that experience like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was bizarre, because the scripts themselves were pretty rough objects. They were written to be read out loud, and so they have notes to myself all over them. They have they're messy page breaks. There's like images pasted in, and also there's a whole layer of editing that took place on them, where when I was reading them out, I thought, well, that doesn't quite sound right, I'll change this, or I've repeated this word, I'll remove that. So I really came to transforming the scripts into a book with quite a lot of work to be done. They were quite rough stones to polish. But it has been amazing to really get them down on paper so that now, people can go to the notes section, see the exact, line and book of Herodotus that this quote came from. Everything's accounted for, everything's right there down in ink, which I think has made it feel like a more robust thing academically. And it means that people can, follow their own research, read the primary sources themselves if they want, and really see where all this stuff is coming from.
Do you find it any more difficult to make the book as engaging as you can make the podcast? Because with a podcast, you have sound, you have images, you have layers that you don't really have with the book. So did you think about that, and sort of how can writers of history make history more engaging? That's what we're always thinking about, is how can we make history more interesting, engaging, and a topic that, people want to learn about?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think there's a slight bugbear I have is that in often trying to make history more accessible to a general public, I think historians often have a slight misconception about what the public wants from their history. There's a huge proliferation of podcasts, YouTube channels, that kind of thing, where we're making history funny. We're doing, it's going to be a cartoon and there's jokes, or maybe like a podcast where two guys are getting drunk and talking about history. We're riffing on things. It's all kind of a joke, and I think there's value to that. People do enjoy that, and they like to feel like, they're not being talked down to from some ivory tower. But I think it also just can risk robbing history of a certain mystery and majesty that people end up being really hungry for. People end up missing without realizing that they miss it. So I think, when I started out, I would, in my episodes, do slightly more references to things like pop culture or make references to the modern world to help people understand things. But as I went along, I started to realize that people didn't want that. They wanted to be transported, and they wanted to forget about the modern world. They wanted to enter this time period and not just come away with facts about it, but enter it imaginatively and feel like they were there.
Well, and not to call Isaac out, but I love the story he told about how prior to, I don't know if it was it moving images, the videos, or was it photographs that you felt, Isaac, that wasn't really real? Like it could just be Game of Thrones. It's all the same.
Yeah, that it might as well be Game of Thrones. Like it doesn't anything prior to, I guess you could say photographs. Like that's where it exists in the same part of our brains.
Right.
Like history exists when I can see it, and that's a person and I can look at them. But the depictions, a depiction on a wall of a ruin might as well be a cartoon for a lot of people. And I do think it's interesting how you talk about being transported, and how you would think that with the amount of detail that you cover, you might feel that you're creating a more solid version of this past for the listener. But to be honest, I actually think I come away from the episodes feeling like there's so much more. Like I've gotten a glimpse through this mist, but like I'm still missing so much. It doesn't, like your shows are obviously incredibly popular, and they're dense and long and well researched. So I think your point is well stated, that it doesn't have to be, a joke or flippant or ironic that we're interested in this. It's if you put the time in, people are genuinely interested, want to know what these, the names of these people and how they lived and all those things. It's and it doesn't feel like you're getting rid of that mystique. It almost feels like you're introducing people to it, despite the fact that you describe things in such detail.
And we don't want to exaggerate. These, we want things still to feel true. These were complex people who lived in human societies, much like our own in many ways, and we don't just turn them into myths and larger than life characters, but they lived often through amazing times, and it's teasing out what's amazing about them while still keeping the whole thing feeling true. Yeah,
that's interesting. So do you feel like you've captured that in the textual version? of this?
Yeah, I hope so. I think as Lynn mentioned, you have to use different techniques in a book in order to evoke the same kind of sense of immersion. So what I've enjoyed is being able to go back and add a little more from the primary sources. I think when you're quoting in a podcast, for instance, I won't quote anything unless it's at reasonable length, a few lines.
Sure.
Otherwise, you're just getting a voice actor to say 5 words or 10 words. And it makes the thing feel choppy. Whereas in a book, you can just do inline quotes that allow you to weave in just a much more seamless use of these primary sources. And in a way that can be more diverse within a single paragraph.
That's actually something that funny you should point that out, is something we in our documentary work that we do besides this podcast, found out that exact thing. It's like, you can't, it does get choppy when you're trying to do that kind of weaving that works in a book, visually or with audio. It's difficult to pull off. And requires something to be very, very specific. Out of curiosity, how did you get into history? What kind of kid were you? Or were you like always digging through the dirt looking for stuff in the backyard, like in the garden, or?
It's an interesting question. I think if I had to trace it, it would be a fascination with the castles that are in South Wales. Although, I mean, there is a sort of story that my parents tell about me, which I must have been 2 years old, and I have a very kind of vague, incipient memory of it, that when my sister was being born in a hospital in London, I was there as a 2-year-old, and I was fascinated by this tile that had fallen away from the hospital ceiling, and I could see the kind of insulated pipes inside that are covered with this like silvery insulation. And as this child, it was like the first thing I'd ever seen wrong in the world. It's the first like bit of damage, or like a moment when I saw that the kind of like your son with the magnolia petal. It was the first time I saw that behind the skin of the world there are other things. Behind the surface of the rooms there are hidden spaces, and that in seeing through a gap or a bit of broken architecture, you can see a hidden world. I think I trace some of this fascination with ruins back to maybe that moment, or maybe that was the first manifestation of it.
Sure.
And then, it's just, South Wales is an amazing place to grow up if you're a kid. And like history, we have a lot of Roman heritage, these amazing density of castles, which the Normans were building to try and pacify the area.
Right.
But, as a kid, they're great.
That's interesting. I would have loved to have access to that kind of
that
kind of history. I don't know why until I became an adult that American history didn't really. Well, I guess we don't have many ruins on the East Coast. No. Yeah, it's not like a thing.
Really,
even the stuff from our founding is pretty well kept. For the most part, like things aren't
completely gone,
or completely gone. Yeah, or paved over.
Those are the two.
It actually wasn't until I understand the feeling that you're describing in the story that your parents are describing, but I think as an adult I felt it a lot more, at least in the United States, on the West, where you see like stuff from the 50s. It's not that old, but like, hey, this bar has like incredibly interesting choices with this thing, and it's a totally like dilapidated. Like it's not like there's a bar inside of a bowling alley near where I live that was it's very specific how it was built. And I'm like, I was sitting around wondering, like, who did this? Like, when was this popular enough for them to be able to put the effort into doing something like this unique? Because like even the window tiling is like, looks like it was handmade. I'm always sitting around wondering, like, who made that choice? Why did that happen? Yeah. So I think that it's an interesting where you like you said had that feeling in a hospital as a young kid, but that sense of wonder and like, well, who was walking here? It doesn't necessarily. I'm sort of talking to our American audience here. Doesn't necessarily limit it. It doesn't mean you have to travel to Wales. Those things are all around you. That sense of like what the times that were before, the people who used to walk halls and used it for different purposes or experienced it in a different way.
We're just
it's very
smaller
cool.
scale.
Time
Same concept,
scale.
Smaller scale. We have our own little ruins.
Listen, Iraq has Babylon. We have bowling alleys.
There's so interesting indigenous history as well. The city of Cahokia on the Mississippi.
Absolutely.
which people are always asking me to do an episode about. But I suppose you asked me earlier, Lynn, about what the threshold for a civilization, and I don't put any value judgment on that term, but a threshold for covering something in the episode has been that there has to be primary sources. We have to we have to hear the voices of the people, and there are just some civilizations like the Mississippians, the Pueblo people in New Mexico, the Indus Valley civilization in Pakistan and India, where it's just too hard to tell this story without them having left some writing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you have a favorite maybe archive story, or just, to me, the things I remember are either I find a primary source and it makes me look at something completely differently.
Yeah.
And I have to rethink everything. Or I just find a source that is something that, for whatever reason, just, speaks to me and becomes one of my favorite finds, one of my favorite sources. So do you have one or both of those? Can you tell us if there are any stories or anything that kind of stick out in your mind?
When it comes to actually having to do the detective work of the primary sources, I mean, the one that I got the most satisfaction out of, just because it took so long, was a particular journal entry by a British East India Company man called Colin Mackenzie, who was the first person to create to extensively map South India, and was one of the first people to write a map, but B, also a kind of detailed account of the ruins of what is now Hampi in Karnataka in South India, but which was in the Middle Ages the capital of the Empire of Vijayanagara. And this journal, to my astonishment, had never been published. There was no, it is not in any book.
Right. So
you get that sinking feeling where you're like, oh my God, I'm actually going to have to go to the British Library and get out my reader's card. And it took so long because a lot of these documents aren't very well categorized, and they don't really have the metadata that tells you what's in them. And so the people there were so helpful and were just like helping as much as they could narrow down the search. But I was really losing hope that I was ever going to find it when, just days into this search, I finally did, in this kind of unmarked bit of paper, wad of paper, just found this wonderful kind of spidery handwriting, just this beautiful account that I was then able to put in the episode. And it was actually, I had kind of started to rewrite the episode around the fact that I wasn't going to find this text. And then had to, and once I found it, I was then able to kind of go back and undo those changes and slide it back in. But
yeah, it sounds like that information wouldn't be in a lot of places then. I mean, as far as, sorry, Isaac, you're kind of one of the first people who were, pulling it back out and actually, being able to use it. So in that way, it's exciting because obviously it hasn't been overused. So this is something new coming out.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it had been read by researchers. I'm not trying to say that I uncovered it for the first time or anything.
Right, it had been referenced before.
But, sure.
Gotcha.
So there was an American researcher who, 20 years earlier, had written that he had read this and had quoted an extract from it in one of his books. But trying to trace down the reference in his bibliography just kind of led me to the big collection.
Right.
And I was emailing him just saying, where did you find this? And he's trying to remember 20 years back when he was, a researcher in London. And he's in his 60s or 70s. And so that was the one that felt the best. Yeah.
Interesting. I just can imagine the excitement. I've been there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is when you're working with, so when I'm trying to find original sources in the original language, for instance, in Burmese or Arabic or, anything like this. My Arabic is not very good and my Burmese is completely non-existent. But if I'm trying to track down something for a voice actor to read, then I need to find the exact passage in a book. So it's trying to navigate through a Burmese document to try and find the exact passage.
Right.
And compare it to the English version, which is usually a kind of detective work of I'll have to learn the numbers in Burmese so I can find the page number and then find the paragraph, and it becomes this kind of bizarre game of Sudoku. But that always feels good when you just know you've got the right one. and you send it to a voice actor to confirm, someone who's a fluent speaker,
Right.
and they say, yeah, you got the right passage. That's always good.
That you put a lot of effort into behind these shows. Like,
Yeah.
I promised myself I wasn't going to learn hieroglyphics for this one, but it's like slowly happening as I do the video. Yeah.
Well, to make your wife feeling better, I very much appreciate the episodes being very well researched and very long. I enjoy the length of being able to really simmer in something for an extended period of time.
Well, I think in this world of generative AI and a lot of fast content, short form content, people do just really appreciate the feeling that someone spent time on this. Someone put their heart into this. I like to think that that's what keeps people coming back.
I guess there's something. This is a larger discussion that I'm curious to get into. At the end of your introduction to the book, you say that this. So actually, before I get into that point, save that for later. How did you choose what went into the book? Because obviously you've had more episodes than what you covered. What was that process like? Yeah,
there were a couple of episodes that fell out of the book. The Nabateans, Bagan in Myanmar, and the Greenland Norse. But primarily because Duckworth, the publisher, just started saying this book's going to be huge, and I thought that was fine, but they were getting cold feet on publishing a 700-page book. So we began that discussion of what are we going to leave out, and I think as I've gone through the editing of this book, I began to realize that what we had was kind of an accounting of human history from the earliest city-dwelling societies up to the end of the colonial period, and that we were telling that story through human failure, through the collapse of these societies, but they kind of formed an almost unbroken chain, each society telling the story of a particular era. So it then became going back to those storytelling concerns about what the arc of the whole book is going to look like. And there were some societies like the Nabateans that were telling a story that was telling a part of the arc of the story that was being sufficiently told in other chapters, which is kind of about the rise of Rome, really, and the Romanization of the Mediterranean, which was being told in Carthage and also in the Roman Britain episode. But it became about creating a kind of seamless tapestry where we could take people from the very beginning up to the modern world in as sparing a way as possible.
Speaking of taking people to the modern world, what I was going to ask before is that, I mean, the value of studying history, I think our listeners are not going to question that in general. But as far as studying civilizational downfalls, what are we getting out of this? Is the book, or is your series in the book a call to action for us to understand more? What is there to glean? You've spent more time thinking about this than most.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question with probably a long and meandering answer. I think, so first of all, I began to get a lot of attention towards the show during the COVID pandemic. A lot of people were stuck indoors listening to podcasts, but there was also this sense that people felt like we were living through an apocalyptic era of our own. It really felt like things were coming apart, that we were living through a period of time that was traumatic and was making us lose faith in some of the institutions that we trusted. And I think people began to feel a sense of connection to these stories about people in the past who had been through similar periods, times when it felt like the world was ending, times when for some people the world really did end. And that we understand that sense of doom, that sense of impending catastrophe isn't a completely modern phenomenon. It's something that people have felt since the dawn of time. And that we can look at their stories as a way of finding comfort, finding strength for what we may have to face in coming years. And, when it comes to modern society, who knows what's going to happen? History always makes fools out of anyone who tries to confidently make pronouncements about the future. And a society like modern industrial capitalism has never existed before. We don't know what it will look like when it ends. Sure. We don't know when it will end or under what circumstances. But we do know that the challenges of the next century are going to be immense. They're going to be possibly the most formidable challenges that humanity as a whole have ever faced. And we're going to need to take perhaps some lessons, but mostly just a sense of resolve from the past, a sense that you can't take things for granted, that, people who lived in Constantinople, in Angkor, people who lived in Tenochtitlan thought those towers would stand forever. They thought the city must have looked as solid and permanent as New York or London looks to us today. And we have to remind ourselves that these things are actually really fragile and they can disappear in lifetimes. Yeah,
I actually found that, as morbid as that sounds, I actually found it oddly comforting. The world has ended dozens of times before, and and we're still around to think about it, and you're still around, able to research it and look back and see. Not to say that life didn't really change and it was as comfortable, post after Rome left Britain, or for people living there in that time, but that humanity as a whole has continued to move forward, and the the next civilization is built upon, like you said, it's a chain, and that keeps on happening. I found that relatively comforting, oddly enough.
There's some hope in that. There's actually some hope.
I think you have to take comfort in that whenever there's a forest fire, it's always followed by green shoots that are fertilized in the ash, and that human societies can be similar. It's not to say that when these times of upheaval arrive, that they're not miserable for many people,
right?
Maybe even for everybody, but that you have to. It's the fact that once you abandon hope that one version of the present will continue, that you can make room for new hopes. You can make room for new futures. I mean, I'm about to be a father, actually. My first child's being born in a few weeks, probably.
Oh, congratulations.
Oh, wow, congratulations.
You,
It's the best.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm very excited. But, it's also tinged with this sense of apprehension that this child, if they live a long and happy life, will live to see the year 2100. And what does the world look like at that point? It's going to be a very, very different world.
Not going to lie, I had similar thoughts when my son was born at the end of 2022. But it's an interesting to ponder, and an answer that we'll genuinely won't know.
Well, it's going to be their battle. It's going to be their future to fight for. The question is whether the major challenge we're going to face is climate change and the stress that's going to put on our societies in countless ways. And the question is going to be, do we have the will to change course, to actually build a world that's sustainable, that isn't destroying the natural environment? But B, is it even possible to change course? Do our societies have a steering wheel that can be turned? Is there an off button? Does anyone know how to turn off the chainsaws?
Right.
Yeah, if there is one thing that is pretty evident from a significant amount of your the research that you do in the episodes you've done is that I think we underestimate what drought and famine can do to it is oftentimes a big factor in a lot of what's happening, whether that's pushing people from one place to another that disrupts how things are going, or outright putting a pressure on an individual society and the organizational structure that they have. That's a recurrent theme. So it's not surprising that we're facing obviously at a scale much larger, like you said, as a whole, but a similar pressure.
It's absolutely true. Yeah, there's an old cliche that every generation has its own fall of Rome, and I recently shared on Twitter a list of a German historian had put together of every reason that had ever been given for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire.
Right. I think I saw that.
From vegetarianism to I don't know, degeneracy or whatever. There's this catalogue of errors apparently. But I think you can fall into the trap of trying to apply your own society's preoccupations to these stories of historical societal collapses that were immensely complex events and rarely had one single root cause. So we can fall into the trap of overemphasizing the role of climate in some of these collapses because that's what we're most concerned about. But it also can't be denied that it's a really recurring theme throughout, whether it's the Mayan lowlands who suffered a mega drought in the 9th and 10th centuries that caused, or was at least a contributing cause, to the abandonment of dozens of large populous cities, the vacation of millions of people from the region, or whether it's the Assyrians and Sumerians who both faced droughts. These are consistent themes that crop up constantly because our societies are somewhere between an organism and a machine, and they're designed to solve the problem of maintaining survival. They're designed to produce the necessities of life: food, shelter, water, but also cloth, tools, etc. And those machines become very finely calibrated over the centuries to a particular environment, to a particular set of inputs. And once that environment changes dramatically enough around them, the stress can be too great, which can often cause what's called a cascading systems collapse, which is when one part of the system fails. And this suddenly causes increased stress to be passed on to all other parts of the system, which fail in turn, until you get a kind of cascading stalling of the entire engine of society, which we see in certain collapses.
One of my favorite quotes that's in your introduction, and it's something that I always have to remind myself, particularly in these days, is that history is not a linear progression, from worse to better, from ignorance to knowledge, from war to peace. And it's something that I think we as humans want it to be that way. We want to just see it as going forward and getting better, which in a way is even more impressive why your podcast is so popular and fascinating, because really you're doing it the opposite. You're sort of starting at good things. We've created this, and here it's all downhill from here, because sort of our impulses are to do it the opposite, where it's, we want it to be a happy ending, essentially. And so I think it's really important today, sort of your message and this idea that history is fluctuating. It's not, bad to good. But I kind of wanted your thoughts on that too, because it's always been a favorite quote of mine about history not being linear.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's it's kind of what Walter Benjamin that you mentioned at the start is writing about, the fact that history is this chaotic maelstrom that is constantly happening to us, and we can barely catch our breath from it before more history is happening. It's this kind of churning of events that builds up a cluster of debris. I think that's something I come back to with these ruined places, that we think of them as places of silence and solitude and contemplation, but these are places of immense violence. Some of these cities were sacked or burned, and in the case of places like the Aztecs or the Inca, these are places where entire ways of life were destroyed quite purposefully and violently. And they now stand kind of like our melting ice caps as statements about the destruction that we've wrought. Yeah, it's something that people have to internalize, that you can't take a better future for granted.
Right.
Sometimes you get this kind of cyclical reasoning with people where they think, well, all these forecasts about climate change are so terrible, but that can't be right because I know things don't go that bad. Things will be better. I hope they will be. And so you project that desire into denialism, or equally disempoweringly into doomerism, where you say, oh, we're all just screwed. We can't do anything. Let's just
nothing we can do. Why bother?
Yeah. Why bother?
Yeah. So I haven't read Walter Benjamin's book, but the metaphor I thought was interesting, because there's something that isn't mentioned in the quotation that you put in, which is the present, which is kind of existing below the angel's feet, like or just at its heels, in a place where it can't see. So it can't see what's happening to us, like as it's happening, or it's only seeing the things that have happened. And I think it's interesting that all that has happened can't be changed. So I do think that, regardless, that it's important to not get sucked into that doomerism mentality, because if there are things worth fighting for, or you see a potential for a future that is better than what the one currently is now, it's worth fighting for, because it's not set in stone. Like you said, there's small there are small cascades that are negative feedback loops, but there's also cascades that can be positive feedback loops in the same instance, where things can build upon themselves in a more positive direction, not necessarily a negative direction.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, and you're trying to walk on a razor blade, where you're trying to convey the very real changes to our planet, our climate, our environment that are not just going to happen, but are locked in. That the northern ice is melting, and we're going to see ice-free summers that are going to feed back into the climate change feedback loop in ways that are going to be immensely destructive. We have to accept that is coming, but we also have to not disempower ourselves by falling into nihilism and doomerism. We have to say there's still damage reduction that can be done. Every moment that we don't change course is another life we could have saved. And we have to build structures in our communities that are resilient to an increase in social dissolution. I think that's the thing, is there's also the tendency to start hoarding water and toilet paper and build yourself a bunker and this kind of thing.
Oddly enough.
But that's not going to help you. Your water won't last long. You need to build a community.
Right.
What we've learned from past collapses is that the only way out of these situations of violence and collapse and so on are for people to come back together and to begin cooperating again, and to begin working together again. That's the only way we can rebuild.
Right.
So who knows what will happen with modern society, but that'll be my child's problem.
Well, I think you've laid a really great groundwork with the work that you've done, a foundation for not just your child, but also like millions of people to gain some perspective on eras like this. And wanted to thank you for all the research and hard work that you've done, and thank you for your time here. And really quickly, I'm going to hold you to not having a long answer, but I'm going to make you pick a favorite if you can. Which is your favorite apocalypse that you've covered?
My favorite apocalypse. I mean, I have a great affinity for the societies of Mesopotamia. I love the Assyrians. I love King Ashurbanipal. But I also love the Inca and the Aztecs. The Inca are so romantic to me, just the beautiful mountains and the clouds and so on. I think that's a period I would have really loved to go back and see.
And is there anywhere else that people can find you? Obviously, your podcast. We'll link it in the description. But is there anywhere else that you are posting stuff? Instagram, Twitter, and things like that?
I'm on Twitter as Paul M.M. Cooper. It's full of Civilisations subreddit. But other than that, no. You can get, this is an advanced reading copy of Full of Civilisations, Stories of Greatness and Decline. It's available in all your favourite bookstores and many of your most hated ones as well.
Well put. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you.